The journey from London to Windsor is a slow, solemn affair. 10 miles of frozen, rutted road lie ahead, and the winter air is sharp enough to crack stone. At the heart of the procession, drawn by 8 colossal black horses, is the hearse. It is more a fortress than a carriage, built to contain the impossible weight of a fallen giant. Inside, a coffin of lead, encased in layers of seasoned oak, holds the mortal remains of King Henry VIII. For days, the kingdom has held its breath. The tyrant is dead. The great, roaring, terrifying beast who bent a nation to his will, who broke with God himself, has finally succumbed to the rebellion of his own flesh. The silence he leaves behind is vast and uncertain. But even in death, Henry is not a creature of peace. Halfway through the journey, at Sion Abbey, the procession halts for the night. The colossal coffin is carried into the ruined church, its leaden weight groaning on the shoulders of the strongest men in the guard. They set it upon a trestle, and a silent vigil begins. But as the hours of darkness creep by, the guards begin to notice something amiss. A strange, sweet, cloying odor begins to fill the cold air. A sound, a low creaking from within the sealed casket, as if the wood and metal are under some immense, unnatural strain. And then it happens. A violent crack, like a thunderclap in the hallowed silence, echoes through the nave. The lead lining of the coffin, unable to withstand the pressure of the putrefying gases bloating the king's corpse, has burst open. A foul, viscous liquid, the liquefied remains of a monarch, seeps through the joints of the wood and drips onto the stone floor below. The reign of chaos, it seems, did not end with the king's last breath. His very corpse has declared one final, grotesque rebellion. How did it come to this? How did the man once called the Golden Prince of Europe, an Adonis of a man, a scholar, a musician, a paragon of Renaissance kingship, decay into a monstrous legend whose body would literally explode from its own corruption? To understand the monster, we must first remember the man. There was a time when to see the young Henry was to see the very image of majesty, tall, athletic, with a shock of red gold hair and a mind as sharp as any scholar's in his court. He jousted like a champion, composed music that could make angels weep, and debated theology with a fiery passion. He was England's great hope, a vibrant sun king, destined to cast a long and glorious shadow. He inherited a stable throne and a full treasury. He was charming, magnanimous, and beloved by his people. But a shadow was waiting for him, not on a battlefield, nor in a traitor's whisper, but on the tournament grounds of Greenwich Palace in the year of our Lord 1536. It was a day of celebration, of sport and spectacle. The king, then in his mid-40s, still desperate to project the image of his youthful vigor, charged down the tilt-yard. The splintering crash of lance on steel was a familiar sound, the roar of the crowd a familiar drug. But on this day, the sound was different. His opponent's lance struck his helmet with brutal force. The king, encased in over 90 pounds of steel, was thrown from his equally armored warhorse. The horse, a creature of immense weight, then fell upon him. The court watched in frozen horror. For 2 hours, the king lay unconscious, without breath, as good as dead. The whole of England believed it had lost its sovereign. But Henry did not die. He awoke, and the man who rose from that tilt-yard was not the same man who had fallen. Something within his mind, within the very architecture of his soul, had been broken. Modern neurologists, looking back at the accounts, see all the signs of a severe traumatic brain injury. The part of the brain that governs impulse control, empathy, and emotional regulation irrevocably damaged. The affable, if arrogant prince began to truly die that day, and in his place, a monster began to stir. a creature of impulse, paranoia, and insatiable appetites. His transformation from a king into a tyrant was not merely a matter of will, it was a matter of wounded gray matter, a slow, creeping rot that began in his mind and would soon consume his body. The first prison Henry built was for himself. It was his own flesh. The leg wound he sustained in that same jousting accident never healed. It festered. It became a pair of chronic, suppurating varicose ulcers that would plague him for the rest of his life. Imagine, if you can, the reality of this, not a clean, heroic scar, but gaping, open sores on both legs, constantly weeping pus and necrotic tissue. The stench. The stench was the stuff of legend. It was a miasma of decay that preceded him, announcing his arrival rooms away. Courtiers learned to carry pomanders, small balls of perfume and spice held to their noses simply to endure an audience with him. The king, this demigod on earth, God's chosen representative, smelled of the grave. And his body swelled, becoming a grotesque parody of its former glory. His waist expanded to 54 inches. He ballooned to nearly 400 pounds. Mechanical devices, elaborate contraptions of ropes and pulleys were required simply to lift him from his bed. To walk from one room to another became a monumental, agonizing effort. This physical decay became the engine of his psychological torment. How could a man who believed himself ordained by God be trapped in such a foul, failing vessel? The dissonance was unbearable, and it curdled into rage. A rage he would visit on everyone around him. His doctors were perhaps the most terrified men in England. They saw the signs of what we might now call Cushing syndrome or type 2 diabetes, conditions that would explain the weight gain, the mood swings, and the ulcers that refused to heal. But to speak truth to this king was to commit treason. To suggest that his body, the body of the nation itself, was weak or diseased, that was a death sentence. A conversation lost to history, but which must have happened in some form, might have gone like this. A trembling physician, his hands shaking as he changes a bandage soaked in pus. "Your Majesty, perhaps a reduction in red meat and wine? And more rest for the leg?" Henry's eyes, small and hard in his bloated face, would fix upon him. The air would grow thick and cold. "Are you suggesting," the king's voice, a low rumble, "that I am not master of my own body? That I, who command the very soul of this nation, cannot command my own health? Be careful, doctor. Very careful. My leg is a wound of state, a trial sent by God. It is not for you to cure, but for me to endure. Now finish your work, before I find a physician with a stronger stomach and a wiser tongue." The doctor would retreat bathed in a cold sweat, leaving the king to his pain and his fury. His body was a walking disaster, a constant, humiliating reminder of his own mortality. And this profound, personal horror he projected outward, turning his kingdom into a reflection of his own internal prison. This prison had many cells, and 6 of them were occupied by his wives. We know the rhyme, the simple, brutal summary: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But the rhyme sanitizes the horror. It was not just about execution. It was about the slow, deliberate art of psychological destruction. Consider Anne Boleyn. Her crime was not adultery. Her crime was failing to produce a son and daring to have her own will. Before he sent her to the block, Henry orchestrated a show trial of such magnificent cruelty it beggars belief. He had men, including her own musician, tortured until they confessed to being her lovers, but the true masterpiece of his sadism was what came next. He forced Anne from her window in the tower to watch the execution of 5 of these men, including her own beloved brother George. Imagine her there, The cold stone of the tower at her back. Below, the jeering crowd, a sea of faces. She hears the sickening thud of the executioner's axe. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, and then 5. The last one, the one that shatters her, her brother. She is watching innocent men die, their only crime, their association with her, all because her husband's ego, his paranoia, and his desperation for an heir had festered into this murderous pageant. She knew with chilling certainty that she was next. This wasn't just an execution, it was a meticulously crafted psychological torture designed to break her spirit before it broke her neck. Or Catherine Hogwood, the teenage bride plucked from obscurity to warm an aging, obese, and rotting king's bed. When her premarital affairs were discovered, Henry's fury was not just that of a cuckolded husband, it was the fury of a god. It was the fury of a god whose idol had been defiled. He didn't just execute her and her lovers, he passed a new law, the Act of Attainder, making it treason for an unchaste woman to marry the king. He was so consumed by his own petty humiliation that he rewrote the very laws of the land to retroactively justify his rage. He made his personal wound a national crime. The women in his life were not people, they were objects. They were vessels for his heir, mirrors for his vanity, and outlets for his rage. Catherine of Aragon, his first and most steadfast queen, was cast aside and left to die in lonely isolation, forbidden from seeing her own daughter marry. Jane Seymour, the one he claimed to love, the one who gave him his son, was dead from a post-birth infection within 2 weeks. Henry waited a mere 9 days after her funeral, before his ambassadors were already seeking out a new bride. The man's capacity for grief was eclipsed only by his capacity for self-interest. These women were trapped. To run was death. To defy him was death for you and your entire family. Their only hope was to survive his whims, to navigate the labyrinth of his moods, a labyrinth built from pain, paranoia, and a brain forever altered by a blow from a tilting lance. And as the king's body failed, his paranoia metastasized, infecting the entire court. The Palace of Whitehall was no longer a home, it was a fortress of suspicion. Henry slept with loaded crossbows by his bed and daggers under his pillow. But this was not enough. Armed guards stood watch inside his bedchamber all night, their purpose not just to protect him from assassins, but to be witnesses, to ensure no one could approach the vulnerable, sleeping monarch. He had spy holes, known as king's lugs, drilled into the walls of staterooms and private chambers, allowing him to secretly observe his courtiers. He employed a network of spies to watch the nobles, and a second network of spies to watch the first. No one knew who was an informant. A misplaced word at dinner, a joke that fell flat, a letter to a cousin, any of it could be twisted, reported, and result in a one-way trip to the Tower. The court became a silent, terrifying theater of flattery, where everyone performed for an audience of one, a paranoid, decaying king and his legion of unseen eyes and ears. Even his own daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were watched, treated like potential enemies of the state in their own home. This paranoia extended to his plate. Every meal was a military operation. The royal kitchens, employing over 200 people, were a fortress within the fortress. Guards watched every stage of the preparation. Every ingredient, from the salt to the water, was tested. And then came the tasters. Multiple servants would have to eat a portion of every single dish prepared for the king. And they would have to wait. Henry, in his paranoid genius, stipulated a 30-minute waiting period just in case a slow-acting poison had been used. So imagine the scene. The great hall, filled with hundreds of silent, watchful courtiers. The king is carried in, a mountain of velvet and jewels, and lowered into his reinforced chair. A procession of dishes begins, enough food to feed a village. Roasted swans, entire pigs, peacocks redressed in their feathers, jellies molded into castles. But first the ritual. The nervous tasters step forward, sample the food, and then retreat to a corner of the hall to be observed for half an hour. The entire court waits, in silence, to see if the tasters will drop dead. Only then, When the food is deemed safe, will the king begin his 4-hour gorge. This wasn't just about food, it was about power. It was a performance. As his body betrayed him, as his legs rotted, and his mind filled with shadows, the one thing he could control was this ritual of consumption. He ate with a furious, desperate gluttony, consuming an estimated 5,000 calories a day. He ate not just for sustenance, but to prove he still could. He was Henry the King. He could devour whole forests of game, drink rivers of wine, and his divine body would endure. He believed that eating swan would grant him grace, that venison would keep him virile. He was eating myths, trying to ingest the power he felt slipping away. It was a magnificent, terrifying, and ultimately pathetic spectacle, a man trying to eat his way out of his own grave, all while the court watched, smiling, applauding, and praying they wouldn't be the next course. And so he returned to the ruined church at Sion Abbey, to the exploded coffin and the final undignified horror. The mess was cleaned, the procession continued, but the chaos was not over. At Windsor, the gravediggers had to excavate an extra wide pit to accommodate the sheer bulk of the coffin. The ground, soft and unforgiving, kept collapsing under the immense weight. It was as if the very earth of England was reluctant to accept the body of its most tumultuous king. Contemporary chroniclers with a grim sense of irony noted one last haunting detail. As the servants mopped the king's putrid remains from the floor of the abbey, dogs crept in and began to lick the stones clean. The man who had declared himself head of the church, who saw himself as second only to God, ended his journey as carrion for stray animals. Henry VIII's legacy is not just the Church of England or a string of unfortunate wives. It's a terrifying case study in the corrosion of absolute power, accelerated by chronic pain and brain trauma. He became a prisoner of his own decaying body, and he turned his kingdom into a cell to share his misery. The Golden Prince did not just die. He was consumed, from the inside out, by the very appetites and anxieties that made him king. His story is a chilling reminder that the greatest monsters in our history are not mythical beasts, but men. Men broken by power, haunted by fear, and trapped within the inescapable prison of their own flesh. The question that echoes down the centuries is not simply what Henry did, but why. Was the tyrant always lurking beneath the skin of the charming prince, waiting for a chance to emerge? Or was he created, forged in the crucible of a jousting accident, unbearable pain and the crushing absolute loneliness of the throne? The truth, like the king's own remains, is likely a messy and inseparable mixture of it all. It shows us that beneath the crown and the portraits, history is driven by the frailties, the fears, and the wounds, both visible and invisible, of the human condition. If this descent into the dark realities of the past has you questioning the sanitized history you were taught, consider subscribing. There are countless stories, buried in the archives, of figures far more terrifying and complex than any textbook would have you believe, and their shadows still linger, waiting to be brought into the light.